one of the things that we talk a lot about with functions is, even though we reserve them as the last thing that we, discuss, they're actually not that difficult or not that special compared to everything else that we've talked about as well. So in the same way that we kind of see everything else like numbers, like strings, arrays, or objects as ways to contain information that we can then pass around back and forth, whether it be passing it into a function, whether it be using it, etc. That's actually the same exact way that we're going to treat functions as well. So without going too much into text here, let's just look at a few examples of ways in which we can use functions, right? So here on this slide, if I have a string called happy string, I can actually push this string 3 times, in this case, into the amazing array. And if we notice, if you remember from yesterday, right, every time I pass happy string into amazing array, I'm actually not passing that particular instance of happy string. What I'm doing is I'm passing a copy of happy into the amazing array. And so when I console.log out amazing array, I see 3 strings, all which say happy. Okay, so this hopefully is very standard for us now to think how we push things into an array. But if we try to do the same thing with a function, the same exact thing happens. Just so you know, when we look up top there, those brackets around the function keyword, the outermost brackets on so basically the very first character and the very last character indicates that it's an array. But in the middle, each function, the brackets around that it's just the way that JavaScript, or at least the way that console log prints out functions. So don't think that that means that that's an array inside of it. That's just a function. And so when we look at the amazing array here, where we push in happy function into the array 3 times, what we actually get is we actually get an array with 3 functions. Okay, and so the point of this is just to show you that in a lot of ways, the whole crux of today's lesson is just, hey, remember all those things that we did with objects and with numbers and with arrays? Well, we can do the same exact thing with functions as well. So in this case here, in the same way that I'm able to add, and I was able to add strings into the array, here I'm also able to add functions into the array as well. And if we actually just kind of slow down a little bit and think about what that means is, hey, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just going back to how the array showed bracket function, comma bracket function.
Mhm.
Why is it that when we type of to see if it's a function, we have to use string? We have to put it in a string form, like with quotations, versus when it prints, it shows it in brackets. Is there any particular reason?
Oh, because that's not a type of that we're printing out. That's just like the actual function itself.
Okay.
Type of is an operator that puts things into like one of like I think 6 categories, like numbers, strings, booleans, functions, etc. This is not us printing like what type of thing that is. That is just what it is, right? So if I was to console log out 6, it would just print out 6. If I was to console log out type of 6, it would give me number.
Okay, yeah, okay, I got you.
Yep.
Hey, David,
Yep.
on that slide that Eric was talking about, if you push happy function with a call, would it be I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm happy?
No, it wouldn't be because when you and we'll talk about this on the next couple of slides here. But when you call a function, remember that JavaScript doesn't care what console log is; it cares what the function returns. And so in this case here, happy function doesn't actually return anything; it just console logs that I am happy. And so if a function doesn't return anything explicitly, then by default it returns undefined. And so if you were to invoke happy function and then push into amazing array, you would just be pushing 3 different versions of undefined, or 3 instances of undefined into the array.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Not especially.
Sure. So if I take a look at this, just copy this code over here to my REPL. So if I was to take a look at this function here, oh, okay, so if I was to, this was the original code here. The point is if I invoke this function here, Well, the question now becomes, what does this return, right, when I invoke it? And if I go up into here, I say that this has no return statement. So this is the same thing as us saying this returns undefined. And so when I invoke this is the same as me pushing undefined. Or rather, let me just does that make sense? Like this part here?
Yeah, so I mean, if happy function on line 3 was actually return I am happy, then it would?
Yep.
Okay.
Right. But right now it doesn't. So therefore, it by default returns undefined every time.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Cool. Cool. So then, yeah. So now that we have these functions inside inside of this array, this is not anything new, right? We've actually done this before, although maybe not in such a mechanical way. But now that we have an access to this function, well, if I know in this case happy function, in this case my amazing array has 3 elements, and each element is a function. If I want to go through and I want to call each function, well, it's the same thing as basically invoking the element, right? So on line 10, I'm going through the amazing array. On line 11, I say, hey, for every element, let's set it equal to element, right? And at this point, after line 11, I don't exactly know what each element is. But by the time I get to line 12, I look at the code, it's like, well, clearly the element has to have been a function, right? Because on line 12, I'm invoking it. And so on line 12, when I invoke element there, that is the same as me invoking happy function on line 4. Right. So once again, nothing special here that we haven't seen, right? Like we've already seen this easily with strings and numbers and even objects being put into the array, right? Now all we're saying is, hey, when we put functions into the array, we can treat them like we do everything else. But the one special thing about a function that we can do with a function that we can't do with any other data type is we can invoke it, right? So there on line 12, me invoking element is the same as me invoking the quote-unquote element in the amazing array. And since each element in the amazing array is happy function, on line 12, that's the same as me invoking happy function.
So why isn't there like a return before element? Like,
why is there a return before element on which line?
line 12.
So why is there no return before line 12?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, line 12. No, I'm sorry. I thought it was a function. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I didn't realize it was a loop. I thought it was.
Oh, you mean line 10?
Yeah, line 10.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a for loop. We're just going through the array. Yep, nothing's being invoked there.
So when it does get invoked, elements on line statement line 12, that means it just returns undefined.
Yep, it returns undefined, but in our screen it will console log out I am happy. So therefore, that's why when we run this 3 times, we will console log out I am happy 3 times, and we will return undefined 3 times.
Okay.
Yeah. But in this case, even though we're quote unquote returning undefined, we're not doing anything with the value, and so it just kind of like disappears, if you will. Cool. So if we're okay with having functions, with and it sounds silly when I say it this way, right? But it's like if we're okay with having functions being stored in variables, which we've been doing already, the entire cohort more or less, and we're okay in invoking it, then that just basically gives us a freedom to use these variables very much like we've used any function that we've created so far, right? So here on line 3, I have a function called logs a type, and it takes in an argument called value, and all it does is it console logs out what the type of the value is. Now, if I pass in a string here, a happy string, well then inside of line 3, so on line 7, I'm invoking logs a type. On line 3, I set the value of the value variable to happy string, and on line 4, I'm console logging out type of happy string, which gives you back a string. If I was to do the same thing with a function, well then once again nothing really changes, right? My logs a type function on line 6 through 8 is still the same as before. And now on line 10, I've created another function called happy function that console logs that I am happy. And when I pass in happy function into logs of type, the value parameter inside logs of type on line 6 there, that becomes happy function. And on line 7, all we're doing is console logging out type of happy function, which I think to Eric's earlier question gives you back function, right? So here it says function because we're explicitly asking it to print out for us type of. Notice how, and this is pretty important, right? One of the easiest ways that to get tripped up here is to think that when you write a function, it's the same as invoking it. But notice how nowhere on this page do we actually ever invoke happy function, right? We invoke logs of type on line 14 there. We're passing in happy function on line 14 as well, but we never invoke happy function, right? We're just treating happy function as a variable. We're treating it by itself as a thing, and we're not running it. So when you're doing the problem sets today, be very careful at every juncture about whether you're passing in a function or you're actually invoking a function and then passing in whatever that returns. And then to just kind of wrap up this idea of why we call this lesson higher order functions, it's because a higher order function is essentially the function that either takes in a function or returns another function. Put separately, it's almost like a wrapper, right? It's almost like a container for another function. So here, the logs type function, it takes in a function, or in this case, it takes in a function that's being passed in as the value, right? And we'll see a few examples of returning functions in the next couple slides.
Question.
Yep.
If you did add those two parentheses that you invoke the function on line 14,
Yep.
would it return the? Would it return the? It wouldn't return console. It wouldn't return function. It would return the undefined, which is null, which is what? It would just return undefined, right?
Right. So if on line 14, if I was to add open and close parentheses after a happy function and invoking it, then the happy function when I invoke it, it would return undefined, and so I would be passing in undefined into logs of type, and type of undefined in JavaScript is still undefined, so I would get back undefined. Yep.
And this is only because it doesn't have a return built into it.
Exactly. Yep. If happy function actually returned anything else that we explicitly told it to return, then it will return type of that, assuming we invoke happy function.
Wait, so because it's not being invoked, you don't need the return? Is that what you're saying? Or
Sorry. So I think
log the type, like for
sorry. So the hypothetical question that we were kind of going down was what happens if we do that, right? So if we do this, then we're invoking happy function, and what we return out of the function matters. If we just go back to the way the slide was originally laid out in this case, it doesn't matter what happy function returns, right? Because we never invoke happy function. So in this case, we're just treating happy function and we're passing this entire thing into logs of type.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Cool. Any other questions while we're here in terms of just kind of getting a good feel for passing in and using and also invoking a function?
I don't understand why people would even create a function without a return statement.
Well, if your goal is to just to print something out, then that would be a valid use case.
Oh, okay.
Right. And then if you remember the session on pass by reference versus pass by value from yesterday, what if in your function you want to modify another object, right? Your goal is not to return a new object. Your goal is just to modify another object. So maybe, and can be a little bit of a maybe like a bad example, right? But like, let's say I have something here that's like, let x equals 0, and then here all I want to do is x plus plus, right? So here my happy function serves me it does me a service of incrementing x, but I don't need it to return anything explicitly.
That makes sense now. Thank you.
Yep.
But if you don't ever invoke it, like if you had that let x equal 0, and then that happy function was x plus plus, and you put happy function as the value in like, it just seems like what how would you ever get x to change because you never invoked happy function to get any of the any of the value in happy function?
Yeah, so in this case, on line 7, all we're doing is we're doing type of, right, the value, and so we don't invoke it. But if we just keep going to another slide, right, like for example here, now this is an example in which we do invoke it. So in this case, on line 3, I have this function called calls a function, and it takes in a variable called another function. And notice how on line 4, all it does is it runs that function. So now, when I have my happy function on line 7 there, and which console logs that I am happy, and then I invoke calls a function, and I pass in happy function. Now I'm invoking calls a function. Calls a function takes in this happy function, it sets it equal to another function there on line 3, and then on line 4 it invokes another function, right? And because another function is equal to a happy function, on line 4 we're just invoking happy function. And so when I do that now, notice how the screen prints out I am happy because now I'm actually invoking happy function. So in the previous example, it was just in that example we didn't happen to invoke the function, but actually in most cases you will invoke any functions that gets passed in, right? Otherwise, I guess maybe this is what your question was alluding to. There's no point in taking it in a function if we don't use it. And so in the majority of cases, if I take in a function, I will be using it / I will be invoking it in some way.
Yeah, that was my sort of my point. But then on this one, why would it print I am happy? Wouldn't it print like undefined? Because if you invoke that console log, I thought that's what it reached, it quote in terms.
So in your understanding, how is a console log and a return different?
Well, console log is actually just a function to print out something on the screen.
Right.
Whereas return is actually giving a value back.
Right. So in this case, what are we doing right now?
I think we're just invoking that function, happy function, up in calls a function. Like,
Yep.
calls a function has a value called another function, and we're passing in happy function, and we're then invoking happy function by invoking another function. But I thought that if you invoke happy function, you just get undefined because of the console log part.
So the console log is printing out I am happy, right? So like that part, hopefully like we can reach an agreement, like that's what's happening. That's what I see on the screen in the top right hand corner, right? Now the question is, what do you do? So well, actually, yeah. So are we comfortable with why the top right hand corner of the screen we see it print out I am happy? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean that's what I would think would happen.
Great. So then the second part of that question is now if I'm understanding you correctly, the second part of your question is what happens to the undefined that gets returned out of happy function?
Yes.
Right. So I think I may have used this analogy with you guys before, and let me know if I haven't. I think in one of our earlier workshops, we ran into the situation where folks were they were using a return statement, but they weren't capturing the return value anywhere, and so it's kind of like, oh, this returns something, but we don't store it in a variable, and so it just kind of goes away. If you remember thinking about how for arrays we had this dot push function, right? And normally when we use dot push, we just do array dot push an element, but in reality, array dot push also returns a number, right? It returns the new length of the array, but in the vast majority of cases we don't use it, and it just kind of goes away, right? The analogy I always give is like it's like you handing a gift to someone, but they don't put their hand out. Like you give it to them, you drop it, they don't put their hand out, and so the gift just kind of like disappears, right? So in this case, it's the same kind of idea, right? So here you're absolutely right. At some point, we are returning undefined. Okay, and so after we invoke another function, this now becomes undefined, right? This now becomes undefined. But the question is, what do we do with this undefined? And if I look inside calls a function, the answer is nothing. I'm not doing anything with this undefined value that gets returned out of happy function. And so it just kind of like disappears, if you will. So this is happening, yes. The not issue, I guess, but the reason why you're not seeing this being printed out is because here we're not console logging out whatever this returns, right? This is going to return a thing, and then we just say, well, that's nice, and we don't do anything with it. And so that's why the undefined is not being printed out or being shown anywhere.
I do think though that on REPL it will return undefined in green letters.
So REPL, the thing with REPL is that REPL will actually return back something coming out. REPL will actually return because the way that REPL runs, it actually runs this as entire page. So what REPL returns is actually the last return statement that it finds. And the not irony, but the interesting thing here is when I do this, you're absolutely right. I do see undefined, but the undefined actually doesn't come from happy function. It actually comes from calls a function, right? Because calls a function also doesn't have a return statement. So calls a function also returns undefined. And so this is the undefined that we see here in green. So if I want to prove this, right, here I've just explicitly written out undefined and undefined, right? If I change this to return, let's say 6, notice how the return value is still undefined. But then if I go back here and I change this to 6, my return value is now 6. And so the point is, unless the only way, so I guess the point here is that like this undefined from happy function, this undefined gets returned to up here, right? That's what this is. This eventually boils down to undefined, but we don't return it. So that's why it disappears. If I want to return it, then I can just do return that, and now this will return whatever this returns. And so now if I change this to 6, this will now return back 6. Right? It's just like a highly logical process of us figuring out at every single juncture what is actually being run and what is actually being returned.
So yeah, so the basically fast and like the hard and fast rule is if a function doesn't return anything, its value is undefined.
It returns undefined.
It returns out undefined because it does not have the keyword return.
Right. By default, everything returns undefined unless you override it with something else. Yeah. And does that make sense to I think someone else asked in the initial question. Does all this make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have to kind of play around with looking at it more, but Martha, I've seen that undefined as well, like on REPL, just on like VS Code too, it'll return. And I always wondered, what the heck is that? You know, where's that coming from? So yeah, this has been really helpful to me, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Wait, so what happens if you delete line 19? Will it also return undefined?
Yep, because remember, if I delete line 19 there, then this function by default now returns what?
Undefined.
Yep. If I don't tell it to return anything, it will by default return undefined. And so up here, this will eventually give back undefined, and so we're just returning undefined here.
Okay.
Yep, and I can prove it very easily. If I just run this, you'll see a return undefined. Yep. Cool. So if I want to, just kind of like, and actually these next few I'm going to go through super fast because they're just examples of what we talked about, right? There's no more kind of new things here in terms of kind of, novel ways of using it. Here I have a function called says hi that takes in a name and it console logs out hi name. Says by, which takes in a name and console logs out by name. And now I have this function called calls with name, and it takes in two things. It takes in the first argument, which is name, and the second argument, which we're in this case calling a callback, right? These are just variable names. They could be anything you want them to be. And if you notice on line 10, what are we doing there? Well, we're taking the second argument that we're passing in. It's going to be a function, and we're going to invoke it and pass in as the argument to that function the first argument we get, right? So we're invoking callback with name, right? On line 10, we're invoking our second argument with our first argument. And so now if I do calls with name and I pass in Sadie as my first argument and says hi as my second argument, And then lastly, and then secondly, if I pass in Sadie as my first argument and says bye as my second argument, on line 13, what that does is it invokes says hi and passes in Sadie as the argument. And on line 14, it invokes says bye and passes in Sadie as the argument. So therefore, I get hi Sadie and bye Sadie, right? This is actually a pretty powerful pattern that you'll see quite often. This idea that, hey, here's this, here's a function, right? And it takes in another function and a bunch of arguments, and all I care about is that I want to invoke the function I give you with the arguments that I give you. So it's a pretty common pattern, and so you'll see this quite a bit, right? But in this case, calls with name is a higher order function because it takes in a function that it then invokes. Higher order function, just for the record, it's more of a description. Like that word doesn't mean anything. It's more of a conceptual description of what it is, but it in and of itself has no meaning. So if I now kind of move on to this world of returns instead of console logs, here's where it actually matters a lot that in your mind, at least, where you see these functions, you're super clear about what return is and what return does. So on line 1, I have this function called add word that takes in a string and it returns that string plus the word world. On line 5, I have a function called calls with func that takes in a func, and it invokes that func with the string hello, and it returns the return value of that. And so on line 9, when I say calls with hello and I pass in the add world function and I capture all of the output and results, well, if I take this step by step, right, on line 9 on the right hand side, I invoke calls with hello and I pass in add world. So I go to line 5 where func becomes add world, and on line 6, that func also becomes add world. And so essentially on the right hand side of line 6, it's telling me, hey, invoke add world with hello. So now I go to line 1. If I invoke add world with hello, then string on line 1 becomes hello, and on line 2 it becomes return hello plus world. So return hello world. All of that gets returned to line 6, right? That's what func returns. But now what do I do with the hello world? Well, line 6 says, hey, return hello world to whoever called me. And so line 6 actually returns hello world back to line 9. And so line 9 becomes let result equal hello world. Did everyone follow that?
No, you went too fast.
Failing to see how string gets evoked in this situation.
Cool. All right, so let's do this step by step. Okay. So let's put all this. Okay. So just kind of bear with me as we go through step by step. Okay. First steps first. It says calls with hello and I pass in hello world. So that means I go back to, in this case, line 27 here, and I just want to make it clear here. Let func equals add world. Everyone good so far?
Yes.
Okay. So
Wait, hold on, sorry. Where does it say that you need to assign add world to func? That's where.
I'm not explicitly assigning it. I'm putting in a comment. I'm just saying that's what happens here, because here calls with hello, I'm passing in add world as the first argument. And here when I look at the calls with hello function, it takes in an argument. And whatever argument I give it, it basically assigns the variable func to it.
Got it.
Cool. All right, so everyone good so far?
Yes.
Awesome. So if func is equal to add world, then func hello is the same as me saying it's add world hello. Right?
Okay, now.
Everyone still with me?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so let's figure out what this highlighted portion, what add world hello is equal to. Well, if I invoke add world and I pass in hello, that takes me back to line 23 here. And if I pass in hello as the first argument, then that's the same as me saying here, let string equal hello. Everyone with me so far so good still?
Yeah.
So now what I do is I'll take this hello, I'll replace it with string, and now this becomes return hello plus world, which if I wanted to shorten that, it just becomes hello world. And this gets returned, right? And so now I'm done with my add world function. So I can come back here, right? Because this is where I called add world, and I replace all of this with hello world. And if I want to finish executing this line of code, it says, well, return hello world to whoever called you. And so I was called down here, called to this hello add world. And so now I replace that with hello world, and therefore my result is equal to hello world.
Okay, what if you replace line 25? So what if you replace return with console.log? Would you then get undefined?
Yep, if I return that with console log, then this would be undefined. And I mean, I'm sure this would
if
flow
you
down
like
here.
Replace
This,
the return with console log.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I guess the point of your question is if I don't return anything explicitly, then I return undefined by default. So the undefined would flow through. Okay. So going back to this example here, is everyone comfortable with how I got to result equals hello world?
So in the previous example, whoever asked that question, I'm not sure who it was, did that return undefined world?
No. So I think the question was basically saying, hey, what if I made this console.log instead of return?
Oh, okay.
And so there's no return statement anywhere here.
Yeah, right. So it wouldn't return anything.
Yep.
Got it.
Cool. Cool. Any other questions? All right. So the next example we're going to walk through is it's very, very similar, except now instead of just giving someone one argument and one function, we're saying, hey, let me give you an array of arguments and a function. And so in this case, in this example here, we have this function called say to all. What it does is it takes an array called names, and it has a function called say with name func. And all it does is we create a for loop. Sorry, we create a for loop, and we loop through all the things in the first argument. So just in this example, we loop through every name in line 7 in group, and we invoke the second argument. So we invoke the function that we're giving, and essentially all we're doing here is we are calling the function say hello with name for every single name in the group array, right? So when I invoke say to all on line 13 there, I'm passing in group from line 7 as the first argument, which is an array of 4 names, and I'm passing in say hello with name as the function, right? If we look at say hello with name, it's pretty simple. All it does is it takes in a name and prints out, console logs out hello name, right? And so if I look at say to all say to all is doing is it's on line 2 is we create a for loop that goes through the names array, and for every single element, for every single name in that names array, on line 3, we just invoke the function that is given. In this case, it's say hello with name, and we invoke it with the name in that array in the given order. Everyone good here? Cool. And then the last kind of thing we'll just make a note of here, not anything explicitly used, but just in the same way that we can create a function with a name, with a variable name, and then pass in that variable, we can also pass in anonymous functions into these into other functions as well. And so here it's the same exact example as before, except rather than calling this function that we made say hello with name, we'll just make an anonymous function that does the same exact thing, and we'll just pass it into the say to all function directly. Okay. In this case, you're right that it does look a little bit weird, like in terms of the spacing, but and this is kind of why. And actually, in this case, I would actually argue that the spacing that the spacing is incorrect here. This one should be indented 1 unit over, and then it should look, well, it should look something like this. This is the proper level of indentation, but we're able to use anonymous functions and pass it into other functions as well. So there's no requirement that we have to name the function.
Wait, so in line 5, are you calling the say with names function?
Yep, and that's a good point, right? So say with names, it doesn't come from whatever I called it down here, right? It's based on whatever the second argument is. And so here, when I pass in this function has no name. But when I pass into say to all, here I actually assign the variable say with name to equal this function. Say with name func to equal this function. And so when I invoke this say with name func, it doesn't come from whatever I name this. It comes from this.
So wouldn't you need the return value if you're calling the function?
I don't need a return value because in this example, all I'm doing is I'm printing out words to the screen, right?
Okay.
If I wanted to return this value and use it for another purpose, then I would need to use a return. But in this example, all I'm trying to do is just print out the name, right?
Okay.
Right. And if I look at the previous example here, notice how even though I called this function, this is the same exact example as before. Notice how this example, even though I called this function say hello with name, when I invoke it, it's still say with name func, right? Because this variable comes from this, not from this. Does that clear things up a little bit?
On the previous slide, like that next one where it says bye everybody, bye Jane, Jill, Pip, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to, like there, just hypothetically, if you were to include the return keyword, it would just jump out of that. It would jump out of the whole function and not continue after Jane.
Yeah. It would return. It would exit the say to all function after the first iteration.
Okay.
Cool. And so the last example that I'll kind of talk about here, once again, right, this is just another example. There's nothing new here. On line 1, we have a function that takes in 2 numbers, and I just return num1 plus num2. Line 5, same thing, except I return num1 minus num2. On line 9, I have a function called calc that takes in a number, an operation, and another number. And all it does is it invokes that operation. It feeds in num1 as the first argument, num2 as the second argument, and it returns that value out of calc. And so here on line 13, if I call 10 plus 20, well then all that does is I look at my calc function on line 9 there, I go to line 10, my operation func becomes the plus function, num1 is 10, num2 is 20, right? And so I get back 30. And then on line 14, when I call calc with 50, comma minus, comma 10, then my operation func becomes minus, my num1 becomes 50, and my num2 becomes 10. And so I get back 50 minus 10 to give me back 40. Right, so like I said, this is a pretty common pattern that you'll see a lot, where you have a function whose entire purpose is for you to give it the function and the arguments, and then it's up to this function to invoke those arguments, or sorry, to invoke that function with the arguments you provided. Cool. The last thing we'll talk about here is this idea of a for each loop. The for each loop is an example that kind of really makes you use a higher order function. So the for each loop is actually very similar to a lot of the other array methods that we've covered before, things like index of and dot push, dot slice, etc. You use it the same way. You have an array and you call dot for each. But what the dot for each actually takes in is it actually takes in a function, right? So before, if I use array.push, I pass in an element to be added in. Here, when I call .for each, .for each is expecting me to give it a function. And so in this case, what .for each actually does is, if I look at line 3, and I have this function called log uppercase, and it takes in an argument, in this case a string, and all it does is it console logs that string when I put everything to uppercase. On line 7, this is how I invoke it, right? On line 7, all I do is I say bridges, which is my array on line 1 there, .for each, and I pass in this function, log uppercase. And when I do that, what this does actually is then what JavaScript, what for each does is actually invokes the function I give it, which in this case is log uppercase. It invokes that function for every single element in my array. So that's why on the right hand side I see console.log, or rather I see capitalized Brooklyn, Golden Gate, and London, right? All it does is it capitalizes those elements for me.
You know, I'm really surprised that the for each does not return Brooklyn, Golden Gate, and London inside an array, since it was an array to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, there's other functions that do that. For each is used more to kind of act on part or act upon the elements as opposed to returning the value of the return statement. What you're thinking of using is probably something more like a .map function.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. And so now the question becomes, and hopefully it is something that's kind of kicking your head, is how when like it's obviously very clear to see, well, yeah, it's gonna invoke log uppercase for me, right? Because I passed it in. But the question is, how does it know what arguments to pass into log uppercase? And so this is kind of where we talk once again about the trade-offs. Where we talk about the trade-offs between convenience and kind of customizability, right? What .for each does is .for each will invoke whatever function you give it, but it will always pass in the same 3 arguments in the same order. And so the arguments for those orders is going to be, the first argument it will always pass it is going to be the element itself. The second argument that it's going to pass in is always going to be the index of that element. And the third argument it will always pass in will be the array itself. And so whenever you want to use something like for each, and you want to write a function that you want to pass into for each, it is up to you as the code author to know that that's how for each works. And so it's up to you to write your function in a way that acknowledges that, hey, the first argument that I'm going to be provided is going to be the element. The second argument I'm going to be provided is the index. And the third argument that I'm going to be provided is the array itself. Okay.
So if that's the case, why is Brooklyn 0 index? Shouldn't it be 1? If the first return value is the array itself, that's 0, right? Then the first element is passed in, that's Brooklyn, that should be 1. If it's the second with
so the function, sorry, so when it invokes your function, right? So if I go back to the previous example, when it invokes .log uppercase, the first thing it passes into log uppercase is the element, right? So if I change this, or actually if I go back down here, right? If I say this is, string, index, and ARR, if I pass log with IDX, this function here, into my for each loop, and I have these 3 arguments, the first argument will always be the element. The second element will always be the index. The third argument will always be the array.
Oh, I see what you're saying now. Okay. Sorry. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Wait, so what do you mean by the array? Like the bridges array
Yeah, the bridges array. Yep, it's the array that we're calling the for each on right now.
Okay, so it's gonna pass what's in the array first, and then it'll pass the actual array?
Yes, it will pass in the element, it will pass in the index of the element, and then it will pass in the entire array.
Does for each mutate the original array, or does it create a new array?
Well, so for each just runs the function with those, like nothing here, like it doesn't mutate the array because it doesn't do anything to it, right? It just runs the function. So if your function changes the array, that's a different conversation. But at the basis, like for each just says, give me a function and I will run this function on every element in your array.
Oh, okay, sorry, I understand now.
Yep.
So if you were to print the array in each iteration, it would be like the for loop. It would first show you, if you were to do to uppercase, it would show you like the array would be Brooklyn in uppercase and Golden Gate lowercase, London in lowercase, and as it went through each element, it would show you, yeah, that the end result would be all of them capitalized. But
Well, so in this case, just keep in mind, we're not changing any elements in the array. This just says, hey, string that to uppercase it, and let's console log it out. We don't store this value anywhere. So if I look at my original array, nothing's changing, right? And so this is what I mean when I said earlier is that like if your function is going inside and changing the element, that's one consideration. Here, we're not changing the element, right? We're just modifying it and then printing it out and then kind of discarding it.
sorry, right. But if you had made it a return as opposed to a console log,
If I made it a return, it doesn't do anything either, right? Because in this case, when a for each calls a function, like it doesn't override the existing element with your return value, right? All for each does is it just calls the function for you.
all right, because we're not replacing. Okay.
Yep. Yep. Cool. So that's pretty much it. Any questions?
So yeah, David, are you, I'm a little fuzzy on this. Are you saying that the for each has, a possibility of 3 arguments and the arguments have to be string and index, or is it just that you could put in there something else and it would return that?
You can call these things anything you want, right? So this could be like my fancy arg1, right? This could be dog, and this could be, like I can even call this one string, right? But all that matters is that when I pass this function into for each will say the first argument you get, regardless of what you call it, it's going to be the element. The second argument you get is going to be the index, and the third argument you get is going to be the array.
Okay. So for each is really an array method, right?
Yeah, that's why we call bridges.forEach, right? And bridges is an array, so we call array.forEach.
Okay, but can you do like could you do an object for each?
No. I don't think objects have for eaches have a for each function. At least I don't think it does.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
To piggyback on
Oh, actually, sorry, really quickly. That's what the for and loop is kind of meant to be for an object, really. Although I guess you don't pass in a function, so maybe it's not quite the same. But you can actually rewrite you can easily write your own custom version of for each for an object. You just got to combine this with the for and loop. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut someone off there.
Oh, that's okay. So, is it right to assume that the for each method replaces the for loop when dealing with arrays?
Not necessarily. So one of the things that the for each does, if you notice, is that for each will call this on every single element. And so if you don't want to call this on every single element, then you don't want to use a for each. So that's like the first limitation. The second limitation, and this is something that's also a little bit more kind of, it's a little bit more, it depends upon kind of what you want to do here. But a lot of times, like if you're doing a for loop, you don't want to write a function to do what you want to do. You just want to kind of do it, right? So if I want to go through an array and I want to like modify every single element, I want to add 1 to it. I guess there is a world in which I could write a function that takes in a value, adds 1, and then returns the value, or I could just use a for loop to do it directly. And so in that case, there wouldn't be any need to do a for each loop. But that having been said, that if you do need to do something to every single element in your array, then you could rewrite every function. You could rewrite that for loop with you could write that for loop with a for each function, but it's probably a bit more complicated than it needs to be at that point.
And just to repeat what you said earlier, and so I can solidify it in my head. You're saying that a dot for each method will first take in the first parameter as the first element of the array, the second parameter as the index of the element index in that array, and the third would be the whole array. But I don't understand where is, I may ask you, uh, what instance would it actually even bother to use the third element? Because it doesn't look like we even use the second or the third in your example here.
Well, so in this example, we use the first two elements, right?
Oh, excuse me, yes, yeah, the first two, the string and index.
Yep.
But where does it ever use the third array, third parameter?
I mean, if I add another thing here and say, and this is the third array, then I would use it, right? And this.
Oh, okay. And you can call it whatever. You can call it like Mickey Mouse, and it would come up with the whole array.
Yep.
Okay.
So do you mean like the name of the array?
No, I mean the actual array with all the values inside of it.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So this is what the document would say. The for each method takes an optional third parameter.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions?
Just a quick question on ES6 symbols. Yesterday, Alex didn't really cover that. Are ES6 symbols, I understand they're considered primitives, and so they're not mutable, but I don't know what an ES symbol looks like.
It's just colon and then the name of the variable. So it's like this and then something like that.
Okay. That's it? That's a symbol?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
At least let me just double check, but it should be. Oh no, it's not. Hold up. It doesn't like something like this. Yeah, let me figure out how to do symbols on. I don't know if REPL supports symbols right now, but that's what conceptually it is. Yeah, and it's something that's like it's a bit more convoluted behind the scenes. So I would stay away from these for now. It's kind of this weird const hybrid. Yeah. But yeah, any other questions on loops, functions, and especially on for each? Cool. All right then. I will pair everyone off into groups, and then we'll start the workshop.